It's been just over 4 months since the Final Fantasy VII Remake released, but owing to the rather imaginative and somewhat controversial ending, there has been a decent amount of speculation around, well, what's next? And that applies to both the project as a whole and the direction the story may take. Square Enix has, thus far, remained coy when it comes to answering those questions in a direct manner, but they have been talking a lot about the Final Fantasy VII Remake in recent times, and this means they have also begun talking about what everyone has affectionately been dubbing Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2, as they attempt to keep everyone warm in preparation for a big reveal later down the line. These conversations have come through numerous interviews conducted with third-party publications, such as a massive 15-page spread in Famitsu, but Square Enix has also started publishing interviews on their own platforms too, the first of which was with Motomo Toriyama, co-director of the Final Fantasy VII Remake. And while the subject of these interviews has often been to reflect and dive more into what was seen within the first part of the Final Fantasy VII Remake, naturally, on the odd occasion, conversation has shifted to the future. Throughout this video, we're going to look to compile every morsel of information disclosed so far about Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2, and we're going to do so in our typical granular style because, while we may not be the fastest to talk about the news, we always try our best to be the most diligent, so you don't have to. Before we do though, I wanted to let everyone know that we will be conducting a brand new community-based survey around the Final Fantasy VII Remake. 3 years ago, we did something similar for Final Fantasy XV, and the response was immense. We had almost 3,000 people take part in the survey, and the insights were fascinating as we dissected the data in numerous ways, and I even know for a fact that the results caught the attention of Square Enix. This time, we're hoping to go bigger and better, so if you have a spare 5 to 10 minutes, there's a link in the description to the new survey. We'd also appreciate if you could share this around to as many communities as possible, as the more respondents there are, the better the data will be. So, we've known since E3 2019 that the development team had already started planning for Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2. This news came via Yoshinori Kitase, the producer of the Final Fantasy VII Remake, as following a successful trade show, which saw the preview build garner significant praise, he wrote a blog post. In the initial sense, he spoke about the depth of content housed within the first part, and how they were pleased that they didn't have to compromise in terms of scale. But after this introduction, he then spoke about the future, saying while the development team finished the first game in the project, we are continuing to plan and outline the volume of content for the second. From the phrasing in this statement, we can imply that planning had been underway for some time before E3 2019, and this would corroborate something that one of the principal artists, Roberto Ferrari, had said back in 2016, as when responding to fans, he may have mentioned already working on multiple parts of the Final Fantasy VII Remake project, even back then. At the back end of 2019, Tetsuya Nomura, the game's director, then confirmed via Square Enix's blog that work had already begun on the follow-up, and he was confident that after playing through the Final Fantasy VII Remake, everyone's expectations would increase as to what they might do in the future with the project. Now that the development staff have seen the very positive reception, this continues to be the case, and as Kitase shared with Famitsu at the end of July, the development team have been given a lot of extra motivation to surpass what the first part has achieved. One of the challenges they face right now though is the current situation that we're all facing. Square Enix has had to adapt to developing the next game via remote working, and Kitase has noted that efficiency has dropped below 100% as a consequence. The good news is that perhaps due to there being so much outsourcing with the first game, that this may not affect things as much as might be expected, and Kitase noted that he doesn't foresee a big impact in the long term in terms of the potential release schedule. And we've already seen, thanks to motion capture artists for Cloud and Tifa, that even the more physical aspects of the job have started to pick up in Japan, as more people are now able to participate in some motion capture sequences. Nomura also noted, without saying anything specific in terms of timeframes, that even though they will look to push the quality higher and make the next game even more enjoyable, they're pushing for the follow-up to have a quick release so that fan cravings are satisfied. And as always, he asked fans to wait until the official unveiling, where their plans for the future will be clarified and everything will become very clear. Who knows when that might be though, as Nomura was saying similar things literally years before they did the big Final Fantasy VII Remake reveal on the eve of E3 2019, so for now, let's just talk about what we know. When speaking with both The Guardian and The Hollywood Reporter, Kitase made a particular point of mentioning that, even though he cannot share specifics, Sephiroth will have a much bigger role to play within the next game. And this served as one of their main motivations for having him appear throughout the first part, before having him then serve as the game's final boss. By Kitase's own words, they wanted to make it clear that his presence as a source of threat is one that dominates throughout the remake project. And this is something that would have resonated with older players, but also new players who only knew about Sephiroth in pop culture. Naoki Hamaguchi, one of the co-directors, also spoke with The Hollywood Reporter about another character who will feature more heavily in the next part, Red XIII. When questioned about why they made him unplayable in the first part and how that decision had disappointed some segments of the player base, Hamaguchi said that those who were disappointed should make sure to look forward to the next game. Subtle. And on the subject of keeping things subtle, the development staff have continued to highlight that the stamp featured within the ending sequence is a different breed of dog compared to the stamp featured throughout the rest of the game. They are refusing to say more than that though, but it's clear that they want people to continue speculating as to what this means for Zack's role within the next part, which means that Zack will most definitely feature within the next part. They have also confirmed that Roche will resurface at some point in the future, and even spoke about their lament that he wasn't able to feature more within the first part. Due to his rather bombastic appearance, they had considered having Roche appear as a boss right at the end of the Midgar Highway, or at the end of Chapter 14, but neither made all that much sense from a narrative perspective, so both ideas were canned. And that's why they want to bring him back in the next game. When speaking with Famitsu, Toriyama noted that spontaneity is one of the character traits that stands out with Roche, so there's a high chance that he will appear in the next installment. It doesn't appear as though Chadley will resurface though, as they didn't respond to questions about his inclusion with very much enthusiasm, but you never know, as it was a decent mechanic for learning new materia. In the Ultimania guidebook, which came out a few months ago, Hamaguchi and Teruki Endo, the battle director, also shared insights around spells and summons. Within their initial draft, summons were not going to feature within the first part of the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and they were also going to restrict magic to lesser tiers. But they decided that even though it was the first part, it should still contain everything that a main numbered installment would contain, so they still made sure to include a decent array of spells, and summons also appeared, despite not doing so in the original. This meant they would satisfy consumer demand, but it also meant there was scope for them to hold more powerful spells and summons back for the future, with Hamaguchi making specific reference to Flare as an example of this. The development team also spoke about their inclusion of characters from the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, and how when they started the project, including these characters was one of their main objectives. They wanted to try and add more context to the story, and to make the world feel more believable. It's why characters like Mireille, Kyrie and Leslie were included, having featured previously within a novel called Final Fantasy VII Lateral Biography, Turks, The Kids Are Alright. For their role within the remake, brand new story content was added to enhance these characters, but only because it made sense to do so. The development team also spoke in the Ultimania about how passionate they were about expanding the backstory of other characters. We got to see the sub-scenario relating to Jesse's acting career, but they also had plans to include many more, such as a sub-scenario revolving about what the Turks were doing, and another where Tifa and Mal worked together to pick out the dress for her infiltration of Don Corneo's mansion. But due to time constraints, many of these sub-stories had to be cut. And if we're looking to the future, especially given the current climate, in order to meet deadlines, small nuances relating to the fleshing out of characters may need to be sacrificed to ensure that deadlines are hit. This may also see them end up being harsher about how and where the compilation features, as they are ancillary details as opposed to the meat of the story. And that raises an interesting point as to what the future does entail. At the moment, Square Enix has been coy about how many parts there will be. They've stopped short of giving any kind of specific number and have even said it could fluctuate depending on how long development times are. Shorter development times would lead to more parts, and longer development times would lead to less parts. The crucial part, though, is the use of the word parts, implying that there will at least be 3. And based on the density of the first part and how the rest of the story pans out, that would make sense. But according to industry experts who are outside of Square Enix and instead deal with the financial side of things, some believe everything will be wrapped up with just one more part, as Square Enix cannot afford to have this be a protracted saga. Square Enix has just announced that the Final Fantasy VII Remake has shipped over 5 million copies. This has generated revenues of approximately $300 million, as confirmed via their recent earnings report, where the Final Fantasy VII Remake accounted for around 80% of their units sold in the quarter. That's very solid performance, but against a development cost believed to be around $144 million, which would then have marketing, the cost of producing physical goods, and other financing layered on top, it's not quite as impressive as it might seem. The original Final Fantasy VII, for example, had a production budget of $45 million, but over $100 million was spent on marketing. And given how grandiose Square were with their marketing this time around, which included the longest advert ever to be aired on Japanese TV, huge brand collaborations, and plenty of TV spots in the US, who knows how much they spent on marketing Remake. Still, as around 40% of the game's sales were from digital downloads as opposed to physical copies, which was much higher than Square Enix had expected, they were able to retain much of the revenue as profit as opposed to giving it straight over to third-party vendors. And in the years to come, this should become the new norm, with major publishers revealing that in Q1 of this year, they received over 50% of their sales through digital, hence the option of the discless PlayStation 5. The other good news is that when Kitase spoke during that E3 2019 interview, he also noted that development of the next part would be much more efficient. They will be able to reuse numerous assets, and they won't have to absorb the cost of the wilderness years where CyberConnect 2 was serving as the lead developer. But the pressure is on for whatever's next with the Final Fantasy VII Remake project to match whatever the first part ends up doing. And this is why they set the game up to end in the way it did. As if they had just done a straight one-for-one remake, it would have satisfied the hardcore, but there would have been little to discuss. Their plan was instead to make sure it was different enough so that fans would feel the need to speculate about what was to come. They needed to add an air of uncertainty, and the ending has been crucial to keeping people invested. On that basis, it's safe to assume that whatever comes next will have to adopt a similar policy as they attempt to stop there being any kind of lag in sales between the various parts. But while it may enable them to pull in decent sales for Part 2, if there is a Part 3 and a Part 4, a similar tactic will need to be employed, and it may become an increasingly difficult challenge to make sure they can continue to keep people invested via speculation, as well as pulling in new players to replace those they lose along the way. And when speaking with the New York Times, Atul Goyal, who's the managing director at an investment bank called Jefferies & Company, stated that he doesn't believe Square Enix will be able to take on that challenge and succeed. For that reason, he's writing a report to potential investors that he believes it would be prudent for the next part to be the last part, as it would mitigate financial risk. He's also predicting that the next part would need to ship before April 2022, so that Square Enix don't see a huge drop in their earnings, following what will be a bumper year for them after the Final Fantasy VII Remake was delayed from its intended fiscal year into the one that also features the Avengers. And it's a prudent assumption, but only if you're thinking about the finances and not about the overall flow of the story. We have seen before though with the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy how much Square Enix struggles to sustain momentum between releases within the same project, and this was also evidenced with the significant drop in sales between Final Fantasy X and X-2. Perhaps that's why Square Enix have been cagey about the length of this project, as they could be playing it by ear depending on how well each installment does. But if the development budget drops to say $100 million and this is sustained with each part as they look to maintain the quality and continue to exceed fan expectations, it's clear that they just cannot afford to have a Lightning Returns. Either way, there is so much to be excited for, and there will be plenty of ways to keep players engaged while we wait for more information. Square Enix's social media will be crucial in this regard, and the conversation around the Final Fantasy VII Remake hasn't stopped. It led to the Final Fantasy account being the third most popular gaming account on Twitter over the first half of 2020, and they show no signs of relenting as they look to push more sales for the first part and keep people warm as they wait for the second. For now though, it's a case of wait and see. Square Enix are planning to put out the second part of their interview with Motomo Toriyama on the 12th of August, and that may be focused more on the future as the first part focused on the past. But we can expect pockets of information to continue to be drip-fed over the next 6 to 12 months, including the release of a brand new Ultimania guidebook in Japan in October, which has been confirmed to contain even more staff interviews. But as we wrap up, let's do so with a couple of questions. Firstly, when do you think Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2 will release? Do you think it will be the last part? And do you think they will be able to match the sales of the first part? Let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoy this update, please hit that like button. As mentioned at the top, if you could also take part in the survey, it would be very much appreciated. There's a link in the description below, and the more responses we get, the better. If all goes well, we'll be looking to share the results at some point during September. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, and of course, a big thanks to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.